Yay Media Group.
The new U.S. dietary guidelines are here, and they are being called the biggest reset in decades. And I agree with that. But what do they actually mean for us, for real people? So, in this episode, we're breaking down what the guidelines are really getting right and where the messaging is still really confusing and what really matters for us. So, consider this your practical, real world version of the guidelines without the hype and without the extremes. A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. Welcome to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball. So by now, you've probably heard about the new dietary guidelines for Americans. They were released earlier this year. The U.S. dietary guidelines, these are something they're updated every 5 years. And so this is the 2025 to 2030 guidelines. And this latest version is being called the biggest reset in federal nutrition policy in decades. And it's true. It really is. I've been getting a lot of questions about it. There's been a lot of conversation in media, traditional media, social media about this. And, some of it is like, well, it's saying that I should have beef tallow and butter instead of plant based oils. Or what's the deal with full fat dairy? Should we start drinking whole milk instead of skim milk? And really, what does all of this mean in real life? And so, one of the things that, nutrition professionals, health professionals are really going back and forth on this a lot. And there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of heated opinions. And even in professional spaces, I was looking at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, that's sort of the hub for registered dietitians. And just even on the social media channels there, the divisiveness among registered dietitians about these guidelines it's strong. So this isn't about that. This isn't about saying what's right, what's wrong. I'm coming into it with my opinion. I'll be sharing with y'all my opinion on these things and kind of taking a step back even like, do the dietary guidelines even really matter? So my husband, every year that these come out, I mentioned they come out every 5 years, and every year they come out, I'm all worked up about some aspect of it, either really fired up, this is a positive, or, this is really kind of where there was a miss. And Brad has been like, Molly, who's even paying attention to these dietary guidelines? Does anybody know that these even came out? And to some degree, I would say he's right. And in years past, I would say he's definitely right. They just kind of came every 5 years. Health professionals like me, dietitians, others are looking at these and kind of seeing what is the US government guidelines saying and how are they guiding Americans towards better health. The difference though this year, the political climate has these really in the spotlight. There's a lot of headlines around these new US dietary guidelines. And so there is more conversation about it, more traditional media, social media coverage of these. There are sort of some buzzy things, again, the beef tallow, butter, whole milk being better, like a lot of questions being raised on them. But I would say to his point, he says, do you think my dad, talking about his dad, do you think my dad is paying attention to the new dietary guidelines? Probably not. Mr. J is probably not tuned in and really losing sleep either way about the dietary guidelines. The average person may kind of see some of the headlines and then move on. But here's where it does really matter. It affects what's being put out there as nutrition policy, or the nutrition guidelines. It's affecting policy. It's affecting food makers, food manufacturers. So, for example, years ago, when the messaging came through the U.S. dietary guidelines, that version of it, whatever particular year that was, about trans fats. The recommendation was let's get trans fats as close to zero as possible. I mean, almost immediately, food makers were pulling these trans fats out of their products, and they had a lot of products with a lot of trans fats, but they hopped to it and they pulled those trans fats out. When sodium was really kind of under scrutiny, starting to be more and more specified of what the upper limits were, Food makers again responded. Now, what was interesting about that, a lot of food makers slowly, quietly, steadily dropped the sodium of a lot of their foods. And so, even if you look at something like frozen meals, like a healthy choice or a lean cuisine a decade ago to now, the sodium in many of the similar types of products, it might be 25%, 30%, or even half the sodium, half less sodium than what it did before. They didn't make a big splash about it, but they were sort of just gradually shifting it down to, again, comply with those dietary guidelines. So, going back to Brad's thing of who cares? Does this really even matter? It does because it affects policy, it affects what's being served. So, even just since the dietary guidelines have come out, whole milk has found its way back into schools and on school menus as an option for kids, whereas before it was primarily or only fat free milk. And so it does matter in that while you may not know the ins and outs of everything in there, it's gonna affect what food makers are doing, what schools, what other types of institutions are doing. So when we look at this and we say, "Okay, I'm not gonna go through line by line of the dietary guidelines. This will just be, sort of a high level overview and what we're seeing of again, kind of where I think things are really solid and where I think, yeah, I wish this was a little bit different. And also just where there's some conflicting messaging. So, first, one of the things that I think just hands down I am over the moon about is how tight and how specific the US dietary guidelines are on ultra processed foods. And so, in one way of communicating this, it's eat more real whole foods. Now, again, going back to health professionals kind of having these hot debates about it, what's the definition? And people are critical of this. Well, there's not a definition of what real food or whole food is. But in general, we can all agree that real whole food is not going to be the ultra processed packaged foods that, a lot of us are relying on. It's not what you're opening the bag of, fill in the blank. So to start with, what I would say, like this is a huge win. I'm over the moon that ultra processed foods has gotten such a specific mention and a specific call out to limit these in our diet. So the emphasis is eat more real whole foods, limit ultra processed foods. And if you've listened to this podcast before, you know that is something that we are constantly there's so many reasons to limit this. They're linked to inflammation, anxiety, mood disorders, blood sugar fluctuations. There's just so many reasons that we want to limit ultra processed foods. So the fact that these have that specific mention, I think, is truly a huge, huge, huge step forward. It's really putting whole food back at the center of it and saying very specifically, as much as we can avoid those ultra processed foods, let's do it. So that part is, I think, a huge win. So when we talk about ultra processed foods, it is going to be our sugar sweetened drinks. It's going to be the chips, the cookies, the sweets. And again, if there's one single change that I would say, hey, this is going to make the biggest impact, it is truly limiting those. So good to go with that. The next part that we'll kind of talk about in the dietary guidelines is protein. And this is another big shift. And so historically, the dietary guidelines or the recommendation for protein was 0.36 grams per pound of body weight. And that's really, really low. Typically, what I'll recommend just in an easy way to kind of convert it to to think about it in terms of like yourself and your own personal needs, I'll usually say let's aim for half a gram of protein per pound of body weight to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. So if someone's 150 pounds, we would say anywhere from 75 grams to 150 grams of protein. And so half of a gram to 1 gram of protein per body weight for the average, just otherwise healthy person, no clinical issues, not anything that's kidney disease or anything like this, renal failure, half a gram to 1 gram per pound of body weight. The dietary guideline or the government recommendations, though, were 0.36, basically a third of a gram of protein per pound of body weight. Really, really, really low. So now the protein recommendations are more in the range of zero point 0.5 to 0.75 grams of protein per pound of body weight. I love this. Now, here's where some of the debate comes in, and some of the headlines are the US dietary guidelines are saying to double protein intake. That's not really what it's saying. If you're already getting a great amount of protein, that's great. We're not saying that all of us need to double our intake of protein. It's more about the previous guidelines were really low and really it just got it up to speed. Going back to some of that debate that I was talking about too, I'll hear health professionals will say, well, what about that person with kidney failure? What about the person who has these other issues and they have to limit their protein? If we're going to take that approach, there's so many other things. We could say the same thing if someone has kidney failure, they also need to watch potassium, for example. And so the fruits and vegetables aren't going to just be as liberal as they would for the average healthy person. So, what I would say for these guidelines, another bit of criticism that people will give is it's not individual enough. This isn't giving people individual guidance. They're not intended to. It's broad, general guidelines. And so when we look at this protein range going to more of zero point 0.5 to 0.75 grams of protein per pound of healthy body weight, I love that. I love that as being the recommendation there. Before, I did feel it was really far too low for the average healthy person. And when we look at why, as we're getting older, we need that protein to preserve that valuable muscle mass. One of the key things of people having frailty, lack of balance, a change in their gait, or loss of mobility, a lot of times that's partly due to a loss of muscle mass, and we call it muscle wasting or sarcopenia. And the more that we can do to prevent that muscle loss as we age, the better. So, strength training, the things that are going to be challenging our muscles and continuing to get that movement in, but protein is also going to be a key element of that. So, helping to preserve that muscle mass as we age, supporting our metabolism, our strength. And also when we're getting enough protein, it's helps us stay fuller longer. If we're having protein-rich meals versus simply just carb-heavy meals, it makes a big difference in cravings and how satisfied we feel versus kind of having that blood sugar roller coaster. So I love the emphasis on ultra processed foods. I love the increase in protein recommendations. So the next space, this is where things I would say the first two things home runs that we've hit on. The next one, when we talk about fats and dietary fats, I think this is where there starts to be contradiction even within the messaging. So just the messages that are coming from literally one paragraph of the dietary guidelines, it is a little bit conflicting. So when it comes to dietary fats, the recommendation is eat more plant-based fats. Put the emphasis on plant-based fats. So if you think about olive oil, avocado, so those are the things that's kind of part one of the statement. Also in there, it says you can include beef tallow and butter, which is different, obviously very different than keep the emphasis on plant-based fats. So starting with keeping the emphasis on plant-based fats, adding in that note of but you could also have beef tallow and butter, to me seems like an unnecessary add, especially when the next part says to keep our saturated fat less than 10%. And so when we look at our types of saturated fat, that's coconut oil would be a plant-based saturated fat, but something like beef tallow, butter, they are high in animal-based saturated fats. So to include in the recommendation to keep our saturated fats less than 10%, but to also include a specific call out for beef tallow and butter, I'm not sure what the drive was to put those in there. I think that things like beef tallow, butter, they can absolutely be fine as part of our normal diet, but when we're looking at where do we want people to put their focus and put their emphasis, when we're saying emphasizing plant-based fats and then keeping the saturated less than 10%, but also, by the way, you could have beef tallow and butter. I think that's where a little bit of that conflicting messaging happens. And then also what gets picked up by the headlines. The new dietary guidelines say eat beef, tallow, eat butter. And that's people's takeaway. Like, because they're not reading what it actually says. They're seeing the headline that says the new dietary guidelines say have more butter, have beef tallow. And so that's again where things can be oversimplified in terms of media headlines, but that's not actually what the guidelines are saying. So I'd say that that's a space that I think the messaging is good of including, keep the emphasis on plant-based fats, keeping saturated fat less than 10% kind of goes along with previous guidelines. Not so sure about the beef tallow and butter. I think that if it was in there, maybe it could have been worded a little bit differently. But I think, which kind of brings us to the next part about full fat dairy, having those saturated fats, even when we look at something with like our Eat Fit nutritional criteria with restaurants, we absolutely have animal based saturated fats that are part of our dishes. Something like a petite filet, real cheese, these things are still going to fit full fat Greek yogurt. We love having these ingredients in there. Something like full fat Greek yogurt, the taste and texture is so much better. Our restaurants are going to much prefer this as an ingredient in their dishes instead of the fat free. So having some of the animal fats, we're not opposed to that. It's again kind of the having that all in those almost like one paragraph seems a little conflicting. This is also an area where I know that as people are listening to it, that last part that we just covered is probably one of the more heated parts, and I don't really feel that strongly about it. I think that if someone is having butter, I would encourage I mean, personally, I love olive oil. I also really like butter, but olive oil is what's gonna be my go-to more of the time. So don't send me any hate mail because 'cause I'm not saying don't have it, but I think that the way that it was stated in the guidelines was a little bit conflicting and a little bit confusing for the consumer. And I think if we leave it at emphasize your plant-based fats, and if you have a little bit of that, that's fine, but keeping the emphasis more on plant-based fats. So the full fat dairy, this is also one where there's again, for so long the message was dairy should be fat-free. Go for skim milk, fat-free yogurts. And the types of fats in dairy are even different than what's going to be in other types of animal-based fats. So when we're talking about full fat dairy, this is definitely anytime we talk about milk or dairy of any type, it can be a heated topic. So when we look at it, just without going too deep into it can be a really deep dive when we look at the types of fatty acids that are in dairy. And how our body's responding to this. But to try to keep it simple, the fat that's in dairy, so full fat dairy has a different type of fatty acids, a unique fatty acid profile, and it has different types of saturated fats, what's called odd chain saturated fats. It also has something called polar lipids that seem to have a different effect on cholesterol metabolism. And so when we look at, the saturated fat that's in dairy is not inherently bad. And then also, what are we getting from that? We're getting our protein, our calcium. And so when we look at also the research on like real world outcomes, again, the research is mixed here, but we're not seeing a consistent results that having full fat dairy is linked to heart disease. Sometimes we see that it's neutral. Sometimes that we see that it's even protective. We also see in some cases it can be linked to a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Again, observational studies, not a controlled double-blind study. So there's still a lot that is to be learned and a lot of research to be done in this space. But when we do look at full fat dairy, that means if someone wants 2% instead of fat-free milk or whole milk instead, and how much if someone's adding a cup here and there of whole milk, or you prefer whole milk in your coffee or a cappuccino, and also Greek yogurt. As we said, our restaurants love full fat Greek yogurt. That's what I usually recommend, always recommend when we can in recipes is either full fat or the 2% versus fat free. And so for having that, just in as kind of peppered through our normal intake, we have a little bit of full fat Greek yogurt or a cup of whole milk here and there. I think that definitely can still fit really well into an overall nutritious plan. So the full fat dairy part doesn't really upset me on this. What I do think is probably the biggest miss on the dietary guidelines is alcohol. And so in the past, for years, the dietary guidelines have said limit alcohol to not more than 1 drink a day for women and not more than 2 for men. And that's been, I don't want to say decades plural, but maybe it's close to that. And that was even before we had all the research and all the evidence that we know about the detrimental effects of alcohol. And so we know that alcohol is inflammatory. There's not a question that it's inflammatory. We see that alcohol is linked to a host of different types of cancers, breast cancer, esophageal cancer. There's just the list goes on of specific types of cancer that alcohol is linked to. And so the old messaging of, drink alcohol or have a glass of wine for heart health has really been shown to be outdated because the drawbacks of alcohol benefits are not outweighing those drawbacks. And when we look at the benefits that you might get from something like red wine, we can get them from other foods. We don't need to get it through red wine. We can have it through other fruits, vegetables, other types of foods that are going to have some of these cardioprotective compounds, dark chocolate, the cacao or the actual cocoa compound of chocolate, for example. And so for years, the guidelines had a upper limit there. Again, not more than 1 a day for women, 2 for men. And now the messaging is basically consume less alcohol, and it's very vague. And so I would say it's very soft. It's not as structured. It's not a specific guidance. And so just simply to say consume less alcohol is essentially where the guidelines left it. Now, I'm going to go for on a soapbox for a little bit. There was, if you do a search, and I'll put a link in our show notes to an interview, I'll find one of the links to it. But what really got me is, so I feel like the guidelines on alcohol really slacked up and really got a lot lighter when the research and the evidence we have around alcohol gives us more reason than ever to say we really want to dial it back and we want to try to, we're not saying for people to eliminate it, but to really be aware of the drawbacks of alcohol and to really minimize it in their diets. And I think that the guidance on this kind of slacked up a bit and didn't get tighter. So the conversation, what I'm going to link to the video for is Dr. Oz at a press conference about the new iteration of the US Dietary Guidelines. And when it came to the component about alcohol, he said a lot of things. He did say, he did indicate kind of loosely that what I just said about alcohol and, sort of the negative impacts of it. But what he said was, alcohol is a social lubricant. So he kind of leads in with this, and there's the benefits, because it's a social lubricant, just don't have it for breakfast. Now, I'm paraphrasing. There was a little bit more in between there, but just don't have it for breakfast. To me, that is really undermining what we know of the detrimental effects of it. It felt like a kind of a flippant, not kind of, it was a flippant type of statement. Just don't have it for breakfast. When we know what people are struggling with, in some cases, they may be struggling with addiction. In some cases, it's simply the social norms and they're having the consumption of alcohol. Again, the negative impacts are far, they're going to far outweigh any of the benefits of it. And so to me, that was something that I felt was a disappointment is the guidelines lightening up on it. Now, going back to Brad's take on this. So as you can imagine, just like in our household, I'm like sharing about this. And what's great is he's not in the health profession at all, but he's been around me long enough that he kind of knows, none of this is news to him. He's hearing it or he's kind of seeing my take or seeing my reaction on things. And so sort of like you said, who's really paying attention to these dietary guidelines? Does it really matter? And, yes, it does, especially when it comes to policy and food manufacturing, et cetera. But this was one that I think I liked his take on it. And I don't think it was just making me feel better. I do think that this is the case. He said, Molly, when we're looking at something like the dietary guidelines, they're tightening up on ultra processed foods. Well, that means food makers are going to shift and start making products centered on more real whole foods. Just like they cleaned out those trans fats, just like they, dropped the sodium. So there are things that are going to be benefits of this. But when did an individual, just any of us, when did we ever let the US dietary guidelines determine how much we're drinking? That's not where most people are turning for how much they're going to drink. So historically, I'm quite sure most of y'all were not saying, you know what, I'm not going to have that second glass of wine today because I'm a woman and the guidelines say not to have more than one drink a day. Probably not happening. We're drinking for other reasons, other motivators, other things are driving it. And so, Brad's like, just because the guidelines were saying one a day for women, two for men, and now they're not, that alone is probably not going to drive or change people's behaviors and patterns in drinking. And I agree with that. He also was like, it's also, distilleries are still going to be making their spirits. Winemakers are still making their wine. Breweries are still brewing beer. That's not going to change. They're not going to be changing the products they're making because the government guidelines say one a day or two a day or just drink less. So I think this kind of falls under one area where it's probably, I do think that that's right. But again, the messaging and the education and maybe using this as a way to kind of frame context for people around alcohol, I do think it's a missed opportunity to really educate the public on some of the drawbacks that aren't talked about. And one big one that I haven't even said yet, we talked about kind of all the other the negative impacts, cancer, inflammation, et cetera. But a really big one that I think cannot be talked about enough is anxiety. And we look at mood disorders, we look at anxiety, we look at just as a culture how much people are struggling with this. And when we look at something like alcohol and just how much this is fueling our anxiety, especially for someone who's consuming alcohol on the regular, I think that that's a huge, huge miss to not use this opportunity to give a little bit more education about that. So when we look at it in the big picture, these are just some of the ones that I wanted to cover specifically of what I thought was really, really good about it and what I thought either a little disappointed or maybe it feels a little bit confusing here. But big picture messaging, I like these guidelines a lot more than I've liked any other dietary guidelines in the past. And the messaging of fewer processed foods, more real whole foods, getting, sufficient protein, bringing it from basically a third of a gram of protein per pound of body weight to at least half of a gram of protein per pound of body weight. I love that. Full fat dairy, I don't mind that at all. Especially when we're looking at things like Greek yogurt, things that are going to have these other nutrient rich benefits. And so I would say, are the guidelines perfect? No. I do think there's some areas of confusion, some drawbacks here, but they are way better, I think, than they used to be. And so looking at the big picture, and focusing on that, the big picture and the wellness goals, instead of getting caught up in single nutrients, single ingredients, pointing fingers, and really looking at saying, okay, collectively, this I do think has us moving in a much better direction and having us focusing on a lot of the things that, in some ways, people are looking at as it's more confusing, but I think really a lot of it is even more simple than before, and looking at foods as a whole, and also finding things that are things that we can really fit into our lifestyle and things that are affordable. We like them, we enjoy them, and they're again fall into that category of real and whole and pulling back on those ultra processed foods. So in general, I am happier with this set of guidelines than before. We used to always say we want to take that old food guide pyramid and flip it. The food guide pyramid, if you've seen the graphic that accompanies the current dietary guidelines, I think it's still kind of a funky looking image. People are kind of pointing fingers and picking at, oh, it looks like clip art. I don't really care if it looks like clip art. It kind of does once I've looked at it through that lens. But again, there's the image of beef on there when we're talking about keeping our saturated fat less than 10%, but it's just the fattiest kind of steak that's on there as the visual representation. So again, do I think it's perfect? No, but I do think it's a lot better than where we'd come from. So I hope that this has been helpful for y'all. I hope there's been some element of this that has maybe cleared confusion. You may agree with some of what I'm saying. You may disagree with what I'm saying. And let me know what you think. Always, you can reach out to me, registered dietitian Molly Kimball at mollykimball.com. So I hope this has helped to simplify things. If you have had questions, or if you're like, that doesn't seem to make sense, or kind of what's the deal with that, again, hitting the high spots on here, we're going to link to the full publication of the dietary guidelines. And again, some of this you may say that absolutely makes sense, or you agree with it. Others you may say, that's not my opinion on it. And there's, like we said, a lot of different opinions, but sharing my take on this new current iteration of the dietary guidelines. So I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball. You've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. And if you'd like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com. And you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next time for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.